بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد بن عبد الله أفضل الصلاة والتسليم. Welcome to the first session of Lessons from the Cave, delivered to you by the Cambridge Muslim College. My name is Samir Mahmoud, and I'll be taking you, inshallah, on this journey through these 4 lessons, inshallah. I'm based in Sydney. It's 4 a.m. here, inshallah. In about an hour, it's going to be Fajr time. I thank you for joining us from various parts of the world. For those of you who are in North America and the UK and other parts of the world, all welcome, alhamdulillah, to this wonderful spiritual session. I feel like I'm in a cave myself right now. It's quite dark outside, the last portion of the night, and it's quite contemplative and deeply moving. The course, inshallah, will run for 5 sessions. In this session, inshallah, I'll be running an introduction. And then in the next 4 sessions after this, inshallah, I'll be running a detailed commentary on the themes of Surah Al-Kahf. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start sharing my slides. I have a lot of slides prepared for you, alhamdulillah. Here we are. And you'll hear my voice on the slides, and then at some point I'll be coming back to a live feed directly to you, inshallah. If you have any questions, please put them into the chat box, and then at some point, inshallah, I'll try my best to reply to them. For those of you watching the replay, perhaps next session, or we'll try to find a way for you, inshallah, to send us your questions. So, Lessons from the Cave. This is the introductory session, inshallah. The Surah Al-Kahf is quite a remarkable surah, alhamdulillah. It has many major themes throughout the chapter. It deals with a lot of topics. But see, these are some of them here that I've listed. The first few verses, or 8 verses, deal with praise and warning. And then there's the famous story of the companions of the cave, which the surah gets its name from. There's the promise of hell and paradise. And there's the promise of the vineyards, or the parable of the 2 men and the vineyards, or the 2 gardens. And then there's a story of Musa and the Abd al-Salih, often referred to in tradition as Al-Khidr, Dhul Qarnayn, Ya'juj and Ma'juj, and then finally the promise of hell and paradise and instructions to the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. What I'll be doing in this course, what I'll be covering, inshallah, these topics here, 5 topics for 5 weeks. Today is an introduction, and I want to focus on storytelling. And then next week we'll move on to the companions of the cave, the parables of the 2 men and their vineyards, Moses and his mysterious companion, and the story of Dhul Qarnayn. So what do we mean by storytelling? Now, I thought the best way to really introduce Surah Al-Kahf is to start by addressing a number of very important themes or ideas that are essential for understanding the Qur'an in general, but more specifically, the way in which the Qur'an tells its stories. So today I'm going to be unfolding the meaning of Quranic storytelling. In the Qur'an, we read many verses that refer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describing the stories mentioned in the Qur'an, like this verse here where he says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in chapter 12, verse 3, نَحْنُ نَقُصُّ عَلَيْكَ أَحْسَنَ الْقَصَصِ بِمَا أَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْكَ هَذَا الْقُرْآنَ وَإِن كُنْتَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِ لَمِنَ الْغَافِلِينَ. What I want you to focus on really, and you can see I hope you can see the translation there. I'm not going to read the translation in detail, but what I want you to focus on really are the 2 words here, naqussu and qasas, because these 2 words, the verbal form and the noun, refer to the key word we're using in this session. Qissa, qassa, naqussu. Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, we, O Muhammad, we relate to you, we tell the stories, the best of stories. And what's so interesting about the meaning of qassa and its semantic field of meanings that surround it suggest the following meaning. Follow in the footsteps of, or shadowing. It's also referred to in another chapter in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inspires the mother of Moses to after she had given her son away, and her son Musa alayhi salam was discovered by Pharaoh's wife, she wanted to keep a close eye on her son. So she would follow in the footsteps, or she would shadow him, but in hiding, so that he or the wife of Pharaoh would not see him. So she could keep an eye on him and make sure that Moses was okay. And so this meaning, qassa, means to follow in those footsteps, or to move gradually in steps. I like the meaning of shadowing because it really conveys the meaning of storytelling, as and I'll explain throughout this lesson, inshallah. Another term that's often used to refer to stories, although it doesn't occur in this context in the Quran, is hikaya in Arabic, hikayat or hikaya. And it comes from the word tuhaki, the verb, which means to mimic or mirror something. And I love this image of this bridge because it really conveys this idea of tuhaki, where the bridge is the thing being mimicked, and the water, or the surface of the water, mirrors the bridge above. And what this means in terms of understanding the notion of a story is that a story really mirrors or mimics a reality. So when an author puts together a story, whether it's a historical story or novel about events that have happened in the past, the author arranges the events of the story in such a way that they mirror the actual events as they happened. So in order to narrate the events of the past, an author arranges the scenes and the chapters in such a way that it mirrors that story in one way or another. And so by reading a hikayah, we really mirror the reality that is being mirrored. So when you read a story, for example, of a hero who travels through the lands on a quest, for example, the hero undergoes a lot of tests and a lot of tribulations and a lot of confronts a lot of danger along the way, and then finally the hero somehow manages to emerge victorious at the end, having gone through these ordeals and having grown and developed and reached some kind of climatic realization at the end. Well, anyone who reads a story like this really is mirroring within themselves the events that are unfolding. And the typical psychology of storytelling suggests that when you read a story, various aspects of the hero and their struggle and their journey and the challenges that they face reflect aspects of your own self, or aspects of your own journey through life, or your own quest. And so somehow we project ourselves into the story, and the story is projected into us, finding its various elements within our the inner journey of that we undergo. And somehow when the hero emerges victorious at the very end of the story, we somehow feel a catharsis, some kind of a relief that we too have achieved the same kind of quest and victory and self-knowledge that the hero himself has acquired. And so this relationship between a story, hikayah, in the sense of mirroring, is quite fundamental to the nature of what a story actually does. The Quranic hikayah mirrors, and this is the key that I want to use in this lesson. But what does it actually mirror? This is the gist of the whole lesson, inshallah. Let's explore this a little bit further. So the Quran and the Quranic stories really are a means of guiding us and lifting us out of the darkness of our depths, darkness of our ignorance, darkness of our forgetfulness, ghafla, leading us up into the light. That's the whole objective. In fact, the whole objective of the Quran is, well, one of its main objective is for it to be a dhikr, a reminder of what is real, and ultimately only al-haq, only Allah is real, and only Allah is truth. And so these stories are meant to guide us through the various chambers of our inner being, up the stairwell to the light, essentially. And so we ask ourselves then, when trying to understand the Quranic stories, how do the stories of the prophets move us? How do they affect us? Because they are profoundly moving. I'm going to tell you the story of Umar's conversion, radiallahu anhu, a little bit later, and the effect that the Quran had on Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, and many other stories like that. How are the stories of the Quran structured? Because seemingly at the surface, the stories seem to have no structure. Of course, anyone who's used to human stories or human novels or human written novels is used to a certain kind of logical, sequential structure to stories. But when we read the Quran, we come across something entirely different. How they're structured, in what way, what language is used, what's the nature of the language that is used in the Quran? Is it just any kind of language, or is it a particular kind of language that is evocative of something profoundly deep within us? How are the verses connected? Of course, we know, for example, that the Quran was revealed according to a certain chronology. The Quran was revealed according to a certain order, but ultimately, when it was compiled towards the end of the prophetic life, the Prophet ﷺ, before he passed away, he made sure that he had rearranged the verses into chapters and rearranged them under divine inspiration in a certain order that is different from the order or logic of the chronological revelations. And so one wonders then, one thinks, one asks the question, how are the verses then connected? And there is an inherent logic that's quite miraculous, and remarkable about the nature of the connection between the verses, as we'll see with a few examples. One thing we notice about the Quran is that it is quite repetitive. We find the stories repeating themselves again and again and again. And this is a repetition that's quite interesting, because seemingly the stories repeat themselves, but when you look closer, you realize that they're not really being repeated. Something else is happening. But it's the story of Moses again, but told slightly differently. So we'll explore that, inshallah, also. What part of us are they addressing? Is the book of the Quran a book of logic? Does it address our mind only? The bias of our age that we live in today is that it is an age that demands rational, logical answers to questions. The Quran has an entirely different approach to addressing the human condition. We're going to see that also in a minute. What lessons are we supposed to learn from the tales or the stories of the Quran? Is there one lesson? Is there one outward meaning, or are there other hidden meanings beneath the surface? The divine authorship of the Quran suggests that the potential lessons learned, and the potential meanings of the Quran are infinite. Imam Suyuti says in his Itqan, the Ulum al-Quran, that the sciences of the Quran and the possible meanings that can be derived are an ocean without a shore. So what are the unique characteristics of Quranic stories? Okay, unique characteristics of Quranic stories. I'm going to list a number of them here today. The first is the stories are brought down. The second is the stories consist of weighty words. The third topic or unique characteristic that I want to focus on in this presentation is that the structure and order of the Qur'an or the verses is non-linear. And the fourth issue I want to discuss is that the Qur'an addresses the entire human being. الإنسان بجملته. القرآن يخاطب الإنسان بجملته. Through imagination. That's a very crucial condition, through imagination. Now, there are many, many other items on this list that I would have liked to add to this presentation, but I think I'll bring them up throughout the commentary on the various parables in Surah Al-Kahf. I wanted to talk about time and temporality, the unique Quranic understanding of time, divine time and human time. The unique Quranic understanding of space and spatiality, the levels of existence and the levels of reality. And many, many other topics like the primordial nature of the Arabic language and the power of the Arabic language. And all these, of course, the themes and topics that I'm discussing are dispersed throughout discussions of the Ijaz al-Qur'an, the miraculous nature of the Qur'an that you find in many, many different sources. What I've tried to do here really is summarize a lot of these insights from the scholars, and then translate them, as it were, into a contemporary idiom or words that resonate deeply with us, and in the hope that we can better understand it. So let's start by exploring the stories brought down, Tanzil. Now, we know that Tanzil means the descent of the Qur'an. We know from the classical sources that the Qur'an descended over 3 stages. It descended from the divine realm to the preserved tablet, and from the preserved tablet to the heavenly earth. Our earth's heaven, Sama ad-Dunya, and from Sama ad-Dunya it descended into the heart of the Prophet ﷺ. It also descended in one night, and it also descended mufassal, or tanjiman, over 23 years. And this is the paradox from the Qur'an. So its tanzil comes from above, from on high. But there are implications for stories being brought down by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're going to read this verse again that we saw earlier, but I want to highlight different words now. Nahnu, and the noon here on Naqussu, Nahnu, Allah, we, the divine royal we, Nahnu. Naqussu alayka ahsan al-qasasi bima awhayna ilayka hadha al-Qur'an. So the idea here is that the stories revealed, the stories you are being told here, and we are being addressed by this verse, the stories being told here are revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that means that there are huge implications for the kind of stories they are. It means that there's a fundamental distinction between the way in which humans tell stories, a human qissa or hikayah, and a divine one. The way in which humans usually arrange stories or a novel or tales usually is through a chronological sequence of events along a horizontal vector of time. So events in human stories usually unfold in time with apparent causal relationships between them. And of course, that's only natural because part of our human constitution, the fact that we are born in time and space in this physical realm, means that we understand events according to a certain temporal logic and a certain spatial logic. However, is this the real connection between events? When we really think about it, when you really think about the link between, or if you ask yourself, why do certain things happen? Why do events happen? And we see the succession of events one after the other. But if we were to look for some of the physical causes or the apparent causes linking events, have we really exhausted the possible links between these events? Have we discovered the real why behind certain events? This is one of the problems today that materialists or atheists have with believers is that the atheists will say that the only possible causal relation between events are the ones that we can observe or we can empirically measure or rationally understand. But any Muslim who has grown up immersed in the reality of alam al-ghaib, which is infinitely vaster than alam al-shahada, or the physical material realm, knows that events have both a horizontal connection between them, and there is also a vertical connection between each and every event and the higher worlds above. And so the real connection between events can never be exhausted or fully explained by the horizontal vector of causal relations that we often observe between phenomena. What exactly is unfolding? In what time? Inshallah, I want to comment on this notion of in what time later when we talk about the inhabitants of the cave, because the issue and the question of time really arises in the context of that story. What I want to highlight here is the complexity of connections between things. If we look at the, if we understand the Qur'anic qissa as a form of shadowing, a form of, you know, when an individual shadows another individual that follows him closely, such that almost mirroring wherever they are going. And so Qur'anic qissa or hikayah, it shadows, follows, or mirrors, but in such a way that it reveals something quite fascinating. As opposed to the linear vector of horizontal connections between events that I showed you earlier, when we look at the world around us, we discover that even something as simple as the physical world around us is a remarkable miracle. And it is infinitely much more complex than a simple A leads to B leads to C. This is an image of our neural networks in our brain. And I'm sure many of you have seen images that display how the neural networks in our brains are so infinitely complex that the nodal connections between them are very difficult to trace and discern, because there are so many infinite connections between things that if you really take one thread and you straighten it out, you get these kind of linear causal connections that we usually think exist between events in the physical world. But in reality, things are so complex and enmeshed together. There are similar images to this one that I showed you about that show that this very similar structure that you see here in this picture reflects the kind of complex network of connections between roots and trees. The roots between trees. Trees communicate and are connected. And we now know that trees communicate somehow and that they are connected deeply in ways that sometimes are very difficult for us to understand, and we're still discovering that. Or if you look at an image of a nebula or various galaxies in the cosmos, the wider universe, you'll see that the complex network of connections between them resembles very much the neural networks of our brain. So it's remarkable how wherever you look in the world of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation, you see this infinite complexity. And yet our mind and our brain is often prone to reducing things to very simple connections. I find this image very beautiful in reflecting also, or mirroring, the way in which the divine names are manifest, or their traces are manifest in the world. Of course, all of existence is nothing but the manifestation and the traces of the divine names. And the divine names are mixed and intertwined to such an extent, like this image here, that it's very difficult to disentangle one from the other, or the trace of one from the other. In the spiritual traditions in Islam, many scholars use the word raqa'iq, or subtle bonds, which, you know, if you were to light a candle and then turn the candle out, you'll notice that it leaves the wick leaves a subtle line of smoke before it fully disappears. This is called a raqiqa. And this raqiqa, or these raqa'iq, are the connecting, the subtle bonds and connections that link and bind everything in the universe to one another, and also that link every single thing to the divine names, and then ultimately to God, the root of all existence itself. And so when we look at an image like this, we're really looking at the image of existence itself. And so when the Quran shadows or mirrors, it mirrors the real, and it mirrors the real connection between things. It mirrors the subtle bonds of sympathy and connections that exist between all things, and all things to the divine names, and ultimately to God. So therefore, when Allah says, نَحْنُ نَقُصُّ عَلَيْكَ أَحْسَنَ الْقَصَصِ, وَنَحْنُ نَقُصُّ, when God tells a story, He unfolds the real threads that overlap, like the warp and weft that weave the tapestry of existence. I often use in my classes this image of a Persian or Turkish carpet. On one side, you see the wonderful patterns of existence. If you flip it up, you see the warp and weft and the threads overlapping, creating the pattern on the other side. So the pattern is the outer manifest world that we see, and the bottom of the underside of the carpet, where you can see these threads overlapping, is the inner network of connections that connect alam al-ghayb and alam al-shahada in a very profound way. And the Quran really is a book that reveals and exemplifies these connections. So what the Quranic story mirrors, therefore, or the nodes of connections that it follows, is really reality itself, not a human reconstruction of it. When we write a story or a book, we're writing a second-hand account of an event that happened. When the Quran narrates a story, it's not giving you a second-hand account of anything. It's putting you in the front seat at the event itself. That's the remarkable thing about the Quran, and why the way it narrates the story, or the way it tells the story, is quite remarkable and fundamentally different from anything we've ever encountered. And hopefully, when we go through Surah Al-Kahf, we'll try to unravel more of this mystery. And so that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in another verse, Al-Imran, verse 62, in hada lahuwa al-qasas al-haqq. Al-haqq. Qul ja'a al-haqq wa zahaqa al-batil. Al-haqq. The translation here of the verse is, indeed, this is the true narration, but it's more than that. It's the true and only reality that we are narrating to you, or that we are telling you. We live in an age in which we're obsessed with objectivity and objective reality. We deploy our rational, logical faculties and our empirical means of study and observation to map this objective reality. And ultimately, really, can we really ever reach it if our faculties, if we are limited creatures, then by definition, it is extremely difficult for us on our own, using our own resources to really map objective reality. And we even have less hope when we reduce all our faculties of knowledge to just rational, logical analysis. So we can't really ever reach this objectivity and objective reality. However, the pursuit of what is objective and real is commendable. It's something that we need to pursue. The Prophet ﷺ's dua, famous dua, was, Allahumma arina al-ashya'a kama hiya. Allahumma, show us things as they really are. But the prophetic guidance suggests that we must seek this kind of pursuit of objectivity, or what is real, in the right place, in divine guidance. Otherwise, it is vain and in vain. The only objectivity is divine objectivity. And the only objective reality is the divine reality and truth, al-haq. Okay, this leads us to the next point, which I want to emphasize. Given the fact that it is the divine that is telling us the Quranic story, given that this Quranic story is not a representation of events, because there's a number of ways of looking at the way in which the Quran tells us a story. If the Quran were merely just to tell us what actually happened, let's say a few thousand years ago with Moses alayhi salam, Musa alayhi salam, and Fir'aun, then if it was just a historical record, an account, the Quran probably would have narrated the story very differently. But it's not doing that. It's not just a better account of what happened, although that is partially the case. It's not that God has a better memory and he can tell us and give us a more accurate account of what happened. The Quran, as far as I understand, the art of Quranic storytelling is not representing a past event. It's really representing the event here and now. I want you to keep that thought in your mind, because I want to unravel that later when I talk about the four parables. But one thing which it is important to bear in mind is the fact that for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who exists beyond time and space, these events that have happened, are happening, and will happen in the future are no different to the divine. In divine realm, all these things are the same. And so the very cosmic divine Amr that brought forth the reality of the events that to us manifest over a sequence of time between Moses, Musa alayhi salam, and Fir'aun, haqa'iq and realities that are still with the divine. And so when the divine holds up the mirror to mirror, because hikayah and qissa means to mirror something, it's not holding up a mirror to history of the past. It's holding up a mirror upwards. And I'll explain that, inshallah, in the next session, inshallah. And this brings us to the very important point of structure and order, tartib. We know that the tartib, the compilation of the Quran under the guidance of the Prophet ﷺ, meant that many of the verses, or the verses that we have them as we have them today, are not arranged according to the order of revelation. The Prophet ﷺ, under divine inspiration, gave the chapters their titles, and under divine inspiration gave the current order of verses within the chapters. And this is very, very telling, because he broke away from the chronological order of revelation to reveal something entirely different for us. If we compare, for example, the biblical story of Moses with the Quranic story of Moses, I like this juxtaposition because in many ways the biblical story of Moses, or the Bible itself, the Old Testament especially, is by and large, despite parts of it being revealed in one way or another, the majority of it was written by human beings, and this is the belief of Muslims. The way it tells its story exemplifies the human order of things. It does so in a linear manner. There's a clear narration of events. If you open up the Old Testament, it goes chronologically from the beginning of time and creation. Eventually it gets to the story of Moses. And in the story of Moses, there are various chapters that one after the other suggest that events are happening one after the other. Moses or the people of Israel, the scenes are sequential, with a clear narration. When you go to the Quranic story of Moses, it's very, very different. We encounter something that's non-linear. The account often jumps from episode to episode. It's iterative and repetitive. So the story of Moses is often repeated several times in the Quran in many, many different places, but it never repeats it in the same way. In the same way that the structure, if you look at a tree, for example, every leaf of a tree is a repetition of another leaf. But at the same time, every leaf has its own identity, and it's not entirely identical to the next leaf. You find in the entire cosmos the repetition of rhythms in nature and patterns is suggestive of the natural order of things. But with every repetition, there is something also new. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala constantly creates and recreates the universe, and when leaves shed in the fall and come back in the spring, although it's the same, it's not really the same. In every instance and in every season, it's very different. So the variety of the universe and the cosmos really shows itself forth within the unity of the repetitive patterns and forms in which they appear. Moses' story, the story of Moses, repeats again and again, every time with a new detail, every time from a different angle, every time flanked from left and right and above and below by different verses. And each verse before or after evokes a different deep psychological, spiritual, existential response in the reader or the reciter. And so each time the convulses and the fluctuations and the movement of the text itself and what it evokes within the reader is very, very different. The Quranic episodes moves in loops, spirals, interruptions, always doubling back and again reiterating the same point, but in a different way. Suggesting that the real link between events is not as clear-cut as a linear narration. The biblical story of Moses is rich with historical details. The way in which the Quran handles historical material is quite remarkable. There is no historical material. There's no details. There's condensation and distillation. The Quran condenses and distills the very essence of events and things down to the very archetypal, essential core and presents them. And in this manner, it's quite remarkable, effective, and evocative. And we'll see examples of all these terms that I'm describing here later as we go through Surah Al-Kahf. The story in the Bible follows the people of Israel out of Egypt. The story seems to leave behind events in Egypt. Whereas the Quranic story doesn't seem to follow a single group. It jumps from people of Israel to Moses to Pharaoh and back again, suggesting that the author of the Quranic narrative is somehow has a bird's eye view of all these events, of course, because it's divine writ, as opposed to the biblical story of Moses, which suggests that the fact that the story of the Bible is narrated as the people of Israel move out of Egypt seems to suggest that the author is with this group of people of Israel, moving with them. And so if you look at this image here with the dark line representing Pharaoh and the red one representing Moses and the people of Israel, you'll see that in the Old Testament and the biblical account of things, as Moses moves out into the desert and then comes across the sea and cuts across the sea with his people, and then he's in Mount Sinai, Pharaoh follows behind, but the events or the author of these events seems to be with Moses and the people of Israel. And so you see that the link between all these events is a linear historical link of the author who's narrating the story when they were in Egypt, when they moved on, when they encountered the splitting of the sea, and when they were in Mount Tabor. And then in the Quranic account, however, is different. You see, the link between Pharaoh and Moses is a divine one. The divine author looks upon Pharaoh, looks upon Musa alayhi salam and the people of Israel. And as Moses and the people of Israel move out, the same perspective is gazing upon both. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gazes upon all things and turns his attention in full to all things in creation simultaneously. And therefore, the link between events is not necessarily a linear historical one, like this, but the link between these two is always provided in the Quranic story by the divine gaze. And I'll have more to say about this, inshallah, later in the course. one of the most remarkable things about this perspective, this idea that the underlying fabric of reality is infinitely much more complex than what ilm al-asbab and secondary causality can reveal to us, is manifest to us quite remarkably in Islamic architecture. This is a Mikanos Dome, and the Mikanos Dome was developed almost over 1,000 years ago in central Iraq, and it developed around the time when there was a lot of discussion in kalam, in Islamic theology and science and falsafa, around the nature of matter, the fabric of reality, the nature of causality. This is the time in which occasionalism was being discussed and atomism was being discussed. And quite remarkably, we know for a fact, historical fact, that the people or the artisans who worked and developed the Muqaddas were mathematicians who also frequented the circles of mutakallimun and philosophers, etc. So there was kind of like a mutual influence between these. The Muqaddas is a quite remarkable structure because it's a structure, but not a structure really. When you look at a Muqaddas like this one here, for example, in the Al-Hamra, you can't really tell the depth of the dome. It could be 1 meter high, it could be 10 meters high. There are several Mikanos domes that are 10 meters high, and you can't really tell because of the visual illusion of these kind of cell-like structures as they intertwine and encircle one another in this perpetual swirling movement. And what's remarkable about the Mikanos is that although we know that a building is supposed to be held up by 4 walls, it's not entirely clear how the Mikanos is held up, because visually it creates the illusion that it's somehow suspended. And that's quite intentional. It's meant to create, the illusion, or meant to create the effect that it is suspended by an inherent law, much more fundamental, the physical laws of causality of the 4 walls that hold up the structure. That beyond the horizontal connections between events that our scientific minds can discover, underpinning all these laws is a law much more fundamental and much more real, and that is the will of God, the divine amr, and the divine names that underpin the fabric of existence. And so this very Quranic idea somehow finds its way into a full expression in Islamic architecture, because of course the Quranic spirit pours into all aspects of Islamic civilization. The third very important topic or idea that I want to discuss in regards to the nature of Quranic stories is the notion of weighty words, qawl thaqil. And the Quran says, "Inna sanulqi alayka qawlan thaqila." So Muhammad, we're going to recite to you, we'll cast upon you a heavy word or weighty words. And these are quite weighty because they're profoundly moving. You know, the Quran, we read in the Quran, for example, that لو أنزلنا هذا القرآن على جبل لرأيته خاشعا متصدعا من خشية الله. If this Quran was revealed to a mountain, the mountain would have crumbled. Mutasaddi'an means something that crumbles or is shattered or fractured under the weight of the words themselves. This is the effect it has on mountains, let alone on people. When the Prophet ﷺ received revelations, he would often, as narrated by famous hadith by Aisha radiallahu anha, he would tremble, he would shake, sometimes he would sweat, he would be filled with fear sometimes because of the overwhelming effect. And that's one of the reasons why the scholars say one of the reasons why the Quran was revealed gradually is because the heart of Muhammad ﷺ could not have possibly taken on the whole Quran at once. And so if we look at, and the Quran describes it very, very much in very many verses, that the effect the Quran has on those who read it or recite it, especially those early Arabs who understood its words, understood its effect, the early Arabs who could fully appreciate the Arabic and whose poetic excellence was such that they really fully appreciated, experientially appreciated the superlative nature of the Quranic discourse. Allahu nazzala ahsan al-hadithi kitaban mutashabihan mathani taqsha'irru minhu julud. Taqsha'irru minhu julud is a very, very powerful way of describing the effect of the Quran on people. The skins shiver. I mean, the effect of the Quran here is not just on one's mind, which it overwhelms sometimes, not on the heart, but also our physical body responds in a remarkable way. After it almost, taqsha'irru also means something, a shiver as a result of something really cold, as if from shock. And then in the next phrase, الَّذِينَ يَخْشَوْنَ رَبَّهُمْ ثُمَّ تَلِينُ جُلُودُهُمْ وَقُلُوبُهُمْ إِلَى ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ. And then a warmth overcomes their skin and their heart. It's a very, very embodied, very, very visceral response to the power of these weighty words. In another verse, the Quran describes those who recite the Quran and understand its meaning. وَيَخِرُّونَ لِلْأَذْقَانِ سُجَدًا. In another verse, or in this verse, يَبْكُونَ وَيَزِيدُهُمْ خُشُوعًا. And so the image here is that they fall upon their faces. خَرَّ إِلَى الْأَرْضِ means someone who collapses, almost like a waterfall, tumbles down out of fear under the effect of this Quran. And so this brings us to the fourth item I want to discuss, really, the fourth idea, which is that the Quran addresses the human condition, or the entire human being, bijumlatihi, through imagination. This is very important. I have a table here, or diagram, that I got from, it's derived from Abdullah Rothman and Adrian Coyle via the Productive Muslim Company. What I found so interesting about this diagram really is the way in which it includes, or somehow creates, a figure of the totality of the human being. And this is the human being here. We consist of spirit, body, heart, and soul, and mind, etc. And the Quran itself, as a discourse, addresses the entire human being. It's not a book that addresses the mind, although it does have sentences, and it does have a lot of logical statements and challenges. It is rational in many ways, but it never exclusively addresses one part of the human being. It always addresses the entire human being simultaneously. That's quite remarkable. Razi, in one of his famous texts, discusses this aspect and says the Quran is the most superlative discourse precisely because it combines the discourse at multiple levels. So the human being is a complex individual, or a complex creature that consists of mind, body, heart. We have a soul, we have spirit, we have emotions, we have mind, we have logic. A text that can address all these simultaneously is almost impossible for a human being to address or write. And so here the Quran addresses our mind, addresses our heart, and addresses our body, as the previous verses suggest. And so to give you an example on the effect, the way in which the Quran addresses the whole human being through imagination, the Quran animates all of living existence. There isn't a single thing in existence that doesn't come to life through the Quran. يَوْمَ تَرْجُفُ الْأَرْضُ وَالْجِبَالُ وَكَانَتِ الْجِبَالُ كَثِيبًا مَهِيلًا. On the day that the mountains will convulse. Tarjufu is a bodily human reaction of convulsion, yet somehow this quality is transferred to the earth and the mountains. The mountains come to life and they convulse. I mean, can you imagine earth and mountains convulsing? Or the mountain turning into a heap of sand pouring down. And also another verse, Al-Wildana Shiba, the heads, the children, young children, on that day of judgment, on the day of resurrection, their hair turns white. This image is extremely powerful. On that day also, as-sama'u munfatirun bihi. It's also a very powerful image of how the sky will break apart. I mean, one can't even imagine a sky breaking apart. Give you an example of how the Quran addresses things also. Give you an example of this verse here, where instead of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying those who turn away from the zikr, they turn their back away from zikr, that could have been a very straightforward, cognitive, rational way of stating it. But what the Quran does is it conveys it through a very powerful image. Those who turn away from the reminder, كَأَنَّهُمْ حُمُرٌ مُسْتَنْفِرَةٌ. They're like zebras or wild donkeys, alarmed. Mustanfira means mobilized, on alert. Farrat min qaswara, who flee. You can imagine the hoofs of this herd rushing through the savannah, with the dust everywhere, fleeing from the zikr. It's a very concrete, very visceral image. It conveys a very simple, as it were, idea that could have been said in a much more straightforward, rational way, but the effect on the self, the effect on the body, the effect on the heart and on the mind, because this idea here, this image the Quran is conveying through imagination, by activating this imagination within us, this image is not just an image, it also contains a very powerful cognitive idea. So it's a rational idea, if you will, while simultaneously being a vivid image, while simultaneously being very evocative, powerful emotional response. Likewise, if we look at these very powerful Quranic verses here, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَالَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا أَعْمَالُهُمْ كَسَرَابٍ. So, سَرَابٍ بِبَقِيعَةٍ يَحْسَبُهُ الظَّمْآنُ مَاءً or مَاءً. So the expression here is kasarab, in a low-lying land. يَحْسَبُهُ الظَّمْآنُ مَاءً. So it's like a person who's thirsty. Those whose actions, who disbelieve, are like someone who's really thirsty, because they disbelieve and they have no good actions. They're like someone who's thirsty and then sees a mirage in the desert, and then as they approach the mirage, they only find لم يجده شيئا. They find it, but it's not real. But then وَوَجَدَ اللَّهَ عِنْدَهُ فَوَفَّاهُ حِسَابَهُ. It's a very powerful image of here conveyed in a very vivid imagery here. أَوْ كَظُلُمَاتٍ فِي بَحْرٍ لُجِّيٍّ. The translation here would be darkness, or they are like darkness within an unfathomable sea. في بحر لجي يغشاه موج من فوقه موج من فوقه سحاب. So this darkness with an unfathomable sea, which is covered by waves upon which are clouds. So imagine this darkness is a raging sea with waves crashing everywhere around you, and upon the waves there are other waves. So you imagine here a tempest, or you imagine a great storm in the sea, and then above that there are these dark clouds. ظُلُمَاتٌ بَعْضُهَا فَوْقَ بَعْضٍ إِذَا أَخْرَجَ يَدَهُ لَمْ يَكَدْ يَرَاهَا. If you take your hand out, you can barely see it. Right? This very powerful, visceral, majestic image, in one instant is conveying a cognitive idea of those who disbelieve, while simultaneously conveying a very powerful, evocative, emotional, visceral image of God's majesty at the same time. It reminds me here of a very famous painting during the Romantic period in the 19th century by Turner, called The Storm, I think. And Romantic philosophers meditated on this painting endlessly. But here you have painted with these kind of words, this amazing canvas, and this remarkable image that addresses the mind, the heart, the soul. It addresses also the body. And then there are many other verses that I'm going to try to go through quickly because I'm approaching my 1 hour. وَتَرَى الْمُجْرِمُونَ نَاكِسُو رُؤُوسِهِمْ. So you see the criminals on the Day of Judgment, نَاكِسُو رُؤُوسِهِمْ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ, which means that the criminals have their heads hanging before their Lord, or nakisi literally means in Arabic, it's kind of flopped forward like this as a result of a sense of extreme shame and regret. They say, وَنُفِخَ فِي الصُّورِ فَصَعِقَ مَنْ فِي السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. Likewise, animating for everyone in creation, after the horn is blown, you can almost imagine that horn blowing through all of creation. And then the terror of that, the result of that terror, sa'iqa, is like when you're hit by lightning. You're hit by lightning, by the sound of this sur, and everything crumbles and falls dead. And then all of a sudden, in the next scene, we see فَإِذَا هُمْ قِيَامٌ يَنْظُرُونَ, and then all of a sudden, everyone's standing in file, millions and billions of creatures and people standing before their Lord, assembled on the Day of Judgment. And again, وَيَوْمَ نُسَيِّرُ الْجِبَالَ وَتَرَى الْأَرْضَ بَارِزَةً وَحَشَرْنَاهُمْ. This key word, وَحَشَرْنَاهُمْ. نُسَيِّرُ الْجِبَالَ, we make the mountains move. Doesn't mean that it really the mountains glide, literally they glide. And وَحَشَرْنَاهُمْ, this very powerful word that suggests that we have assembled them like a herd, and they're all huddled up, crammed like sardines in a can. This powerful image here, the last one here that I'm reading, يَوْمَ تَرَوْنَهَا تَذْهَلُ كُلُّ مُرْضِعَةٍ عَمَّا أَرْضَعَتْ. You see a nursing mother. Anyone who's ever had a baby and seen a mother with their child will see her like a hen sitting on her eggs. Even if a wolf approaches the chicken, the mother hen will never move off her eggs. And yet here, the pregnant woman will be distracted from her child while nursing, that she was nursing. Nothing distracts a mother from nursing her child. You imagine this powerful image. وَتَضَعُ كُلُّ ذَاتِ حَمْلٍ حَمْلَهَا. And every pregnant woman will abort her pregnancy. The baby will just come out because of the horror and terror of that day. وَتَرَى النَّاسَ سُكَارَى وَمَا هُمْ بِسُكَارَى. You see people intoxicated or drunk, but they're not really drunk. They're drunk because of the horror of the day. And so these remarkable images here, the Quran, powerful, vivid, imaginative ways. And by imaginative, I mean it evokes the imagination to conjure up very powerful verbal images to replace a simple, straightforward, logical argument or statement. And so, if I were to summarize what I just said right now, I would say that the language of the Quran is the language of the fitrah. The language of the stories and the storytelling of the Quran is that of the fitrah. As the word of God brought down from on high, the Quranic stories address the soul directly. They don't address your mind. You know, if the Quran was addressing your mind, we often have the habit as ego-driven creatures that when we're confronted with a rational argument or statement, that we often get quite defensive. You know, our ego is on alert. But the Quranic discourse is something entirely different. It's written by the person. It's written by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who knows your inner constitution and who knows the manner in which your faculties overlap with one another. And so it addresses you in your entirety in such that it bypasses any ego defenses you may have. When Umar radiallahu anhu first picked up the Quran in the house of his sister, he picked it up and he trembled. He dropped it, according to one tradition. He dropped because it didn't give him a room or a chance to really respond with some kind of rejection, really. It really bypasses all those defenses and shakes you to your very core, beyond the ego consciousness. It addresses the soul directly at the primordial substratum of our existence, at the fitra level or fitraic level of universal truths and patterns found in all human beings, cultures, and religions. through the use of vivid images, symbols, parables, psychological plunges, existential ruptures, spiritual flights, and primordial sounds. One thing I wasn't able to discuss right now, but hopefully we'll discuss throughout the commentary, is the remarkable way in which the sounds of the words and the meanings of the words correspond. Earlier, I mentioned that the image of wave upon wave, the way in which it unfolds in the Quran, the way it's written, is like a cascade, is an overlapping, like every verse almost is like a wave that overcomes the next verse after it. And so the way in which the words follow one another in the Quran and the way they're pronounced and recited and articulated reflects profoundly the meanings of the words themselves. And this is quite unique. It's one of the i'jaz of the Quran. And as such, the Quran, therefore, or the Quranic stories reveal the hidden connections between the unseen and the seen worlds, that thicket of connection that bind all things to each other. So very quickly, well, I don't think I have time right now, to be honest. So maybe in the next session, I'll get into an introduction to the cave. I had 2-3 more slides, but it will take me another 10 minutes to finish that. What I'll do right now is actually, I'll stop sharing my slides and I'll go back to, hopefully, inshallah, to see whether any of you have any questions. Okay, so I have some of the questions here being sent to me. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So I'm going to see if I can answer it. What is Earth's heaven, the place where the Quran descended before entering the heart of the Prophet? Sama ad-Dunya, sorry. Sama ad-Dunya is literally the heaven of our Earth. So the Quran talks about وَخَلَقْنَا سَبْعَ سَمَوَاتٍ طِبَاقًا. So there are 7 heavens. Of course, the Prophet ﷺ in his Mi'raj went through 7 heavens. The first one, the first heaven is really the heaven that engulfs our earthly existence. And so in the traditions of Tanzil Quran, it talks about how the Quran descended in 3 stages or 3 moments of descent. The last one being from into Sama ad-Dunya, and from Sama ad-Dunya into the heart of the Prophet ﷺ. Can you recommend any books or articles to read for a deeper understanding of Quranic storytelling? There are more unrelated questions on, okay, so to be honest with you, there are many academic texts. I can't think of a title right now, but maybe I'll save that. I'll do that for next time, inshallah. I'll try to produce a title for you for next time. Inshallah, then we can, I can suggest that. But there's one comment I want to make in regards to what I said in this lesson. It's very difficult to find what I've listed to you, the 4 things among 7 or 8 that I wanted to originally discuss. You would find these independently discussed in many books of i'jaz al-Quran, but some of them are not even mentioned and discussed. And there's a reason for this. It is because, how should I say, they were so obvious to the audience or people who were so familiar with Arabic and the world of the Quran that they're not familiar to us today. And so I've tried to make them as a bit more explicit than usual. So for example, many of the ulama did not discuss in great detail this question, what I talked about earlier, about the role of imagination. They talked about the ability of the Quran, like Abdul Qahar al-Jurjani and a few other authors like Zamakhshari. They did discuss certain aspects of the poetic quality of the words themselves. But I didn't get into a lot of details about the psychological, spiritual effect of these on us, on the recipient. They discussed more the linguistic nature of the words, or the similes, or the badi' and the eloquence. Another issue is when I talked about the linear nature of Quran, so the non-linear nature of the Quran and time and space. They're not really discussed in some of the books, or many of the books explicitly in the way, at least, that I was articulating them, because it was so immediately obvious to most of the scholars that they didn't really bother writing about it. Why it's not so obvious to us today is because of the huge gap that separates us from the world of the Quran. One important thing to understand about the reality of the Quran today is that we are so far away from the world of the Quran, its categories of meaning and being, its horizon of meaning, that we're no longer able to naturally, or I would say we're not able to, but by and large, we seem to be drifting away, further away from the world it unfurls. When it first emerged onto the stage of human history and consciousness, it erupted like a volcano. And it erupted as a voice from the unseen. And then it coagulated, and it preserved that kind of power of the divine word. But the human word is crushed underneath that weight of the divine word. And so you find fragments of the letters throughout the Quran, fragments of independently standing letters, almost as if they are fragments of human language crushed under the weight of the divine words. They are letters that articulate primordial sounds, but they don't yet constitute words. And so if words are things, because in the Quranic worldview, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks, His divine speech constitutes the fabric of reality of things, then the letters are the substance or the prima materia out of which the things of the world are constituted. And so you see that in the Quran itself, Quran preserves that primordial material of existence out of which creation is made or brought forth. Many of these items are not discussed because they were known and implicit. Today, we are so far away from that sometimes we need to make it a lot more explicit and draw it out, which means that we need to articulate it sometimes in a new language, and highlight certain things that maybe traditional scholars didn't always do. Okay, there are a few more questions related to Dajjal, Ya'juj and Ma'juj. I'll cover those throughout the course, inshallah, when they come up. What I want to focus on, as I said in this session, is giving you a few core ideas to help them navigate a deeper understanding of the parables that we're going to discuss in subsequent weeks, inshallah. Okay, if there are no more questions, or if you do have any outstanding questions, please send them to us in the chat box and we'll collect them. Otherwise, I'll try to answer them next week, inshallah. I'm going to go off now. Fajr Adhan is happening right now at this instance. So it's time for prayer. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين سبحانك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.